The early 90s saw some pretty fierce competition in the home video game console market, at least in North America. After dominating the 80s and reviving the industry with the Nintendo Entertainment System, Nintendo controlled over 90% of this market and used this control to impose strict licensing agreements on anyone who wanted to make games for its consoles. It was content to sit on the success of its 8-bit machine, which had been a smash hit. But as the 90s approached, a company you may have heard of called Sega beat Nintendo to market with a 16-bit machine known as the Genesis, or Mega Drive for those of you outside of North America. A first-to-market advantage combined with an aggressive marketing strategy, focus on an older demographic of gamers, and the breakout success of Sonic the Hedgehog helped Sega capture a 65% market share of the console market by 1992. A stunning number considering Nintendo's dominance just a few years earlier. Nintendo's hands-off business-as-usual attitude towards Sega had not served them, and they needed to respond. It was under these circumstances that we would see Nintendo release some of its most iconic games on the Super Nintendo during the second half of its life cycle, games that would ultimately help it outsell the Genesis for the generation. Games like Donkey Kong Country, and the topic of today's episode, Star Fox. What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to the Unlockables, the story of video games, the people who play them, and the memories made along the way. As always, I am your host. My name is Eric. I'd like to thank you so much for tuning in wherever, whenever, in time and space you may be located. It means so much to me that you are here checking out what is going on with the show and checking out what is going on in the world of video games. Our episode today is one that is a bit outside of my comfort zone. Usually on my show, I like to play and talk about games that I can really dive into the lore and the narrative and analyze the theme of the games. That's kind of been what my show has been about for the majority of its run, especially considering that a large focus of my show for many years was on my Guiding Keys Story of Kingdom Hearts series. So doing a game like the game I'm doing today is a little bit different for me, and I'm going to have to find a way to talk about some different things because there's not really a lot of lore and themes and stuff to break down in the way I normally do in today's game. And today's game is, of course, none other than the legendary Star Fox on the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. But before we begin our episode on Star Fox today, if you'd like to keep up with what is going on in the world of the Unlockables, please go over to linktr.ee/Unlockables podcast to see all of the links to all the different social medias, to the Discord server, and to where you can find the podcast. That is the best way to keep up with what is going on, what is coming down the pipeline, and everything that is going on within our community. So, with that out of the way, let's dive in to today's topic, Star Fox. Star Fox, which was known in PAL regions as Starwing, is a 1993 rail shooter game developed by Nintendo EAD and Argonaut Software and published by Nintendo for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, also known by its popular acronym, the SNES. Speaking of Argonaut really quick, Argonaut was a British developer that had been around since the early 80s, but they're probably best known for their work on Star Fox and the Croc series of games. They were liquidated in 2004, but have recently returned in 2024 to release remastered versions of some of Argonaut's library, starting with Croc Legend of the Gobos, and also to be a publisher to third-party and indie developers. Star Fox was released on February 21st, 1993 in Japan, March 22nd, 1993 in North America, June 3rd, 1993 in Europe, and June 5th, 1993 in the United Kingdom. As far as some review scores go, it has an 88% on the aggregator games rankings, and as for major publications at the time, Computer and Video Games gave it a 96%, EGM scored it a 35 out of 40, EP Daily 9 out of 10, Famitsu 34 out of 40, GamePro 5 out of 5, Nintendo Life 9 stars. Is that 9 stars? 9 out of 10 stars. Nintendo Power, 4.1 out of 5. Official Nintendo Magazine, 96%. Superplay, 93%. Video Games and Computer Entertainment, 8 out of 10. Cube 3, 9 out of 10. And Electronic Games, 95%. Star Fox would go on to sell 4 million copies by 1998. And in the year it was released, it was awarded the Best Shooter Award in 1993 by EGM, and in 2018, Complex ranked it 24th on a list of top Super Nintendo games of all time. So starting off a little bit with my experience with Star Fox for the Super Nintendo and the series as a whole here, I know that I had this game on the Super Nintendo. The Super Nintendo was, like you've heard me say multiple times, my first console. It was the console that introduced me to playing video games. So I know I had this game on the Super Nintendo, but I couldn't tell you when I got it. It certainly wasn't on release because I know that I didn't start gaming until about 1994, 1995. That's when I started to really get into video games. I remember really, really loving this game when I played it as a kid. And this was around the time that I had first seen movies like Top Gun and Independence Day, and I was just absolutely head over heels in love with like fighter jets and planes and the idea of like being a fighter pilot fighting aliens and invaders. I just thought it was like the absolute coolest thing at the time because I had like seen those movies, and I don't know if it was good or healthy for a like 5 or 6 year old to see Top Gun or Independence Day. I was so in love with all those things that my friend and I used to build little Lego ships and have battles whenever we would go over to each other's houses where we would like fly the ships around and basically recreate scenes from Independence Day or Top Gun or Star Fox. And so Star Fox was a part of this obsession. And I think around this time too, my dad first showed me Star Wars. So around this time I was really into ships and planes and things in space. It just was kind of a perfect storm of likes for me. But despite my love for Star Fox on the Super Nintendo, this is the only Star Fox game that I have any experience with. I didn't have Star Fox 64 on the Nintendo 64. Another one of the probably marquee titles that I missed for the N64. Didn't play Star Fox 64. Didn't play Mario 64. Didn't play Ocarina of Time. What was the point of having a Nintendo 64 if I just missed all the big games? Banjo-Kazooie. I don't know, but back then you had to be careful and picky about what games you wanted to get because you only were able to get like 1 or 2 a year for birthdays or for Christmas. And by the time the Nintendo 64 was out and I was getting games, Pokemon was kind of in full swing. So I just wanted everything Pokemon, and I just wanted games based on properties that I knew. So wasn't interested in getting like a Mario or a Star Fox game for the N64 when I could get Pokemon. I also had a PS1, so I was getting PS1 games around the same time. So that kind of prevented me from getting Star Fox 64 on the Nintendo 64. And I also missed Star Fox Adventures, Star Fox Assault, Star Fox Command. And it wasn't until we finally got the mythical Star Fox 2 release with the Super Nintendo Mini that they put out a couple of years ago that I had any interest in returning to the series, because that's a really unique circumstance that a game from so long ago, a sequel to a popular Super Nintendo game that was basically finished and just sitting in Nintendo's archives, it's insane that they would release that so many years later. Maybe there's an episode on Star Fox 2 down the line where we can kind of dive into that. I think it's really fascinating. I would say that since Star Fox on the Super Nintendo, since playing that game, my experience with Fox and Friends has been more defined through the Super Smash Bros. Series, where Fox and, to a lesser extent, Falco are usually considered like top tier characters, especially in Melee. Obviously, I've absorbed some Star Fox things through memes and like the cultural zeitgeist, you know, like do a barrel roll and how everybody like hates Slippy because he just is always in trouble. But Team Star Fox has always managed to remain some of my favorite characters just because their designs are so cool. Yeah, my experience with the Star Fox series isn't really super deep. I had played the original for Super Nintendo, and since I'm kind of doing this thing where I'm just playing and recording my thoughts on my podcast about a bunch of games, I had played Star Fox like last year, and I picked it up again this year just to play it again and check it out. And it kind of encouraged me to go and check out the rest of the series. So I think after this episode, I definitely want to go and finally play Star Fox 64 because I've heard nothing but great things about Star Fox 64. Opinions that lead me to believe that that is probably what many consider to be the pinnacle of the series. So we'll probably be doing that a little bit later down the line. Before we move on to the rest of the episode, let's hear what our community has to say about Star Fox for the Super Nintendo.
Hi, this is Chris Copleen from the Retro Hangover podcast, and first of all, thank you, Eric, for giving us all an opportunity to share our thoughts on these games here as part of Unlockables Radio. So, Star Fox. Wow, what an experience. I'll more talk to this here right now in the moment as a game that came out when it did, which I think was in 1993. No one had ever really seen anything like this on a home console, at least most gamers, I would say. That was the hook, that was the advertisement. That's why everyone knows what the Super FX chip is. Prior to that, all we had really was Virtua Racing in the arcades and Virtua Fighter 1 also in the arcades. And of course, people were wondering if this was the future of games. Of course, on a grand scale it was, but it had to get somewhere, it had to start somewhere, and that was Star Fox. That was the hype, the polygonal dream that came out. And it just can't be a polygonal game and that be it. We had those before in the past. Games like, I think, Faceball, in a sense. You had the game X for the Game Boy. You had Hard Drivin' from Atari to some horrendous results among others, but Star Fox actually played like a video game, taking its cues from masterpieces like Afterburner, which are very, very obvious if you compare the opening to the tracks in Stage 1 Corneria to the Afterburner theme song, which isn't Stage 1 in that game, coincidentally. But when you really break down Star Fox and how it introduced third-person shooters to gamers in a way that I don't think many of them have experienced before, even with Afterburner and Galaxy Force coming from Sega in the past. You have a game with branching paths that still manages to hold that Nintendo magic. It controls very well for its time, it has personality, it has characters that have silly voices, and it has a varying difficulty on how well you can play the game, with a lot to explore. Now, today, does it really hold up? I haven't played it in a very long time. However, I have played it sometime within the past 10 years or so. And what I can say is, for the most part, yes, but there is so much slowdown that it's really hard to look past it today. This was something that, of course, you could kind of ignore back in 1993 because you were staring at something beautiful, for lack of a better, not beautiful, but technologically impressive. You were staring into the future, and now you're not doing that anymore, so it's harder to accept. It's just one of those games that turned the tide for Nintendo back in their favor, stealing the thunder from Sega, which at that point was beating it, and really gaining some momentum until they could get Donkey Kong Country out to seal the deal for the Super Nintendo's victory in that generation. This is a landmark game. It's the beginning of a franchise that, I won't say a great franchise, but it had that, and then the Nintendo 64 game, and it's been pretty rocky ever since. But there's a reason why this series is so renowned, and I think a lot of people would point to 64, but the excitement for 64 was real because just of the hype, the excitement, and the overall appreciation and love for this game when it came out then, and it was well earned. It was well earned. Don't know if it would be received the same way, in the same manner, just because a lot of people don't like the reverse Y-axis controls, and there are some problems with hitting wings and your characters always begging you for help. But overall, I think it's still fine, still a really fun game, and that's all I have to say about that. So thank you once again, Eric. This has been Chris Copleen from the Retro Hangover podcast.
Hello, Unlockables listeners. Once again, it's Dave Jackson from Tales from the Backlog. And when I saw Eric post that he was looking for submissions for Star Fox for the Super Nintendo, I went, hey, that's weird. I'm playing that game right now. What a coincidence for Star Fox for the Super Nintendo. So, I'm a longtime fan of Star Fox 64. I grew up playing that game. It's one of my favorite games of all time. I love it so much. But I had never played the original Super Nintendo Star Fox game until now. And I kind of thought, hey, I love that game so much, I might as well try the original. I had no idea that Star Fox 64 was basically a reboot of the original game, just using more advanced hardware to do more stuff with it, like tell a story, for example. And so the thing that really jumped out to me when I first played this was, early 3D. And it turns out not only was it early 3D, it was one of Nintendo's first 3D games in general. Their second one, and the first to use polygonal graphics. And I gotta say, not a great first outing, in my opinion. I'm sure that at the time, if I was like, whoa, look at Nintendo doing a 3D shooter, this thing that's usually side-scrolling or top-down, this genre that was probably much more popular then, to be honest. And now we have it in 3D, that's super cool. And a visual advancement can wow you. Kind of maybe putting myself in shoes that don't exist here, but that's kind of how I feel about it. And then trying to play this game now, I had a hard time playing this. I didn't really like it that much. I honestly had a hard time reading what was going on the screen a lot of times because it is 3D graphics. It is kind of impressive, of course, especially when you consider the Super Nintendo, but kind of hard to see what's going on, kind of hard to read everything. There's not a lot of room on the screen for stuff. So when the screen gets busy with stuff, the screen is full of stuff. And that's not to say that I found the game overwhelmingly difficult. I did beat it. I did not go try the extra routes through the game, but I didn't have a great time going through it. I didn't really the gameplay wasn't great to me, especially the first-person sections. Didn't like that at all. The music was a bit of a letdown coming from, most Nintendo stuff to be example, but also comparisons with Star Fox 64. Honestly, I don't know if the music is that great or not, because most of the time it's drowned out by the constant laser, sounds. So stuff like that. It's one of those games where I see it, I'm like, yeah, I can appreciate it from a historical perspective, but did I enjoy playing it? Not really. Am I glad that I played it because it recontextualizes one of my favorite games of all time, Star Fox 64? Yeah, for sure. Glad I played it. And glad I got the chance to share the thoughts with everybody on the Unlockables. Thank you again, Eric. If anyone out there would like more of my thoughts, you can find that on my show, where there are hundreds of hours of my thoughts about various video games, including some stuff that Eric's been a part of in the past. That's Tales from the Backlog. You can find it wherever you listen to podcasts or on YouTube. Thanks, Eric. See you next time.
So let's talk a little bit about the history and development of Star Fox. And you can't tell the history of Star Fox and the story of the development without knowing about something called the Super FX chip. So Star Fox is considered the second 3D Nintendo game, the first being a game titled X on the Game Boy of all things. But Star Fox was the first game to use 3D polygonal graphics on the Super Nintendo with the help of the Super FX chip. Now, the Super FX chip was designed by Argonaut Software themselves, so that's where they tie back into this story, and they helped co-develop Star Fox to show off the 3D rendering capabilities of the chip that it could bring to the Super Nintendo. Fun fact, the code name for the Super FX chip during its development was Mario, which stands for Mathematical Argonaut Rotation and Input/Output. Also, fun fact, doing this research, I learned a new term. This type of acronym is actually called a backronym, where you take an existing word and make an acronym out of it, essentially. So, like, Mario exists, so it's like, oh, it'd be cool to call it codename Mario and just use those letters to describe what it does. So, backronym, your vocab word of the day. There's a lot of technical things that the Super FX chip does, but most of them go over my head. You guys know from listening, I'm not like a hardcore video game hardware guy. Most of the time I just turn the machine on and Oh, it's magic. Magic makes the game appear on my screen. I'm pretty ignorant to the inner workings and machinations of video games and resolutions and FPSs and refresh rates and all this stuff. I'm not really into that side of gaming, and since I grew up in an age where not all games looked spectacular, I guess I have a little bit more tolerance for when things don't look cutting edge. Like, I'll go back and I'll play anything at any frame rate, and it doesn't really bother me. What the Super FX chip basically does is it renders 3D polygons and it assists the Super Nintendo with some more advanced 2D effects. The 3D models aspect of this are more prominently portrayed in a game like Star Fox. Well, some examples of the 2D effects that it could produce are shown in Yoshi's Island, with the way the sprites kind of grow and shrink and expand and stretch and do all of that crazy stuff that's known in Yoshi's Island. Like when you defeat the boss and you like zooms towards the screen and like shrinks and will expand and do all this crazy stuff. The downside of using something like the Super FX chip, though, to kind of turbo boost the Super Nintendo's capabilities is that it increased the manufacturing costs for Super Nintendo cartridges, because the chip was not put into the Super Nintendo. The chip was included on the actual cartridge of the game. You couldn't just start putting it into Super Nintendos and have newer Super Nintendos out there that had better capabilities than what the older Super Nintendos did. So because of the increased manufacturing costs for Super Nintendo cartridges due to this chip, it was only ever used on a handful of games. And this list includes games like Star Fox, obviously, Dirt Racer, Dirt Tracks FX, Stunt Race FX, Vortex, Doom, Super Mario World 2, Yoshi's Island, and Winter Gold. I didn't expect to talk about this aspect of Star Fox's development when I started doing my research, but as the years have gone by, as I've gotten a little bit more into content creation and learning about video games as a whole, I've been trying to go back and learn about the history of the medium, the history of the industry. And the past couple years, I've been reading more into what was going on between Nintendo and Sega at this time, because I had always just kind of dismissed Sega as like this upstart. Oh, they burned bright for a second, Sonic the Hedgehog, and then they flamed out and basically got crushed by the PlayStation 2. But I'd been reading a lot more about this time period specifically, and what a crazy time it was in the world of video games. Sega had really closed the gap on the market share in North America, and Nintendo kind of let them do this by not taking them seriously. Sega had like a really aggressive marketing campaign in which they designed their commercials and their messaging to appeal to an audience that was older than Nintendo's kid-centric audience that they were trying to sell to. Because at this time, remember, Nintendo historically was a toy company, and as the video game industry grew and matured, we're still kind of defining what it means to be a video game. Video games are still treated like toys by a large majority of people, and this fit perfectly with Nintendo's age demographic. They wanted to go after kids because kids' parents were the ones that had money. And this was really successful strategy in the 80s and basically early 90s when Nintendo's dominant run was going on. I mean, it was a crazy statistic, like 3 out of every 4 households, or like 75% of households had a Nintendo Entertainment System in them in the United States, like at the height of Nintendo's power, which is just absolutely insane market penetration. So Sega employs some really interesting strategies around this time. But yeah, I bet you didn't expect that you were going to get a history lesson on this episode of Star Fox, did you? So Sega at this time makes a number of drastic moves, at least in the North American market, to kind of respond and see if they could take some of the market share away from Nintendo. And they do a couple of things. They managed to get out their 16-bit console, the Genesis or the Mega Drive, out before Nintendo. They got it out in 1988, whereas the Super Nintendo wouldn't be out till 91. So they had a 2-year advantage of being in the market for their 16-bit machine. And Nintendo didn't even want to make a 16-bit machine to begin with. They were happy that every household in America, 75% of households in America had a Nintendo Entertainment System in them. So they didn't want to have to go through upgrading their hardware and trying to get new hardware into every single person's living room. They had hardware in there already, so they just wanted to keep making and selling games for the existing hardware. But technology was advancing at such a rapid pace that when Sega's 16-bit console came out and was doing things that the Nintendo Entertainment System just couldn't do, Nintendo was kind of forced into making a next-generation console, making a 16-bit generation console. And during the time that they were developing that, Sega was putting together this plan to take market share away from Nintendo in North America. And they did that by, hiring a gentleman by the name of Tom Kalinske, who, there's a lot of debate around what his tenure at Sega was able to accomplish and how much credit he should actually get. That's not the point of this episode. They hired Tom Kalinske. One thing I will give him credit for is he put together a really good team on the North American side, a team that was able to craft really clever marketing strategies and campaigns to achieve their goals. And their goals, what they wanted to do was aim for a more mature audience and really just kind of take it to Nintendo by doing direct comparisons side by side so that the consumer could see that the Sega console was better than the Nintendo console. And the main way they did this is they showed off Sonic versus Super Mario World and showed how slow Super Mario World looked by comparison. This was an effective strategy because, yes, if you line those two games up side by side, Mario does look very slow in comparison to how fast Sonic the Hedgehog plays. Now, I will argue that even though the whole tagline of gotta go fast around Sonic the Hedgehog is like the whole point of his game, I think it's difficult to call that game a platformer and go fast and play that game as skillfully as possible if you're just going really fast. The game almost requires you to slow down sometimes to get through some of the levels. But I digress. We're not talking about Sonic and Mario. We're talking about Star Fox, right? I'm setting the stage for Star Fox's existence because I want you guys to understand the context in which Star Fox was made, because I don't have as much lore and themes and crazy shit to dive into that I normally dive into. So this is the context in which Star Fox starts to be developed. Finally, after a couple years into the 90s, Nintendo was kind of had this strategy of just ignore Sega, don't respond, business as usual, just keep pushing forward. Nintendo's quality will speak for itself. But its partners, with Nintendo had a very strict licensing agreement for the NES, were tired of Nintendo's control of the market. So with some convincing, Sega managed to get a lot of players and a lot of partners on their side. They managed to get into retail stores, which was incredible because people didn't want to piss off Nintendo because people made a lot of money selling Nintendos in their stores. But Sega managed to get into big box retailers like Walmart. They managed to get big partners on their side like EA, and Sega was well known for having these sports games on their system. And so by 92, 93, Sega is firing on all cylinders. They're taking market share away from Nintendo, and Nintendo decides that they have to respond. They start fighting back with marketing. They start figuring out what games they can put out to compete with the stuff that Sega is putting out. Around this time, to kind of close that gap and make the argument for the Super Nintendo, Nintendo was bragging about all of the different things that the Super Nintendo could do, like the Super FX chip and Mode 7. And Mode 7 is a graphical mode in the Super Nintendo that is most famously featured in Super Mario Kart and F-Zero, games like that, to make those games look the way they did. Again, I don't have the technical explanation of what exactly that does, but Mode 7 was the thing that they were marketing. And Sega responded by highlighting its blast processing. So Star Fox was a game that Nintendo felt like they could use to help turn the tables, to help close the gap with Sega and strengthen their technology messaging. So around this time, we got Star Fox, and then we got Donkey Kong Country. And of those two games, I would argue that Donkey Kong Country looks better, but we'll get to that. So this is the context in which Star Fox was developed and created by Argonaut. The main game design was, of course, done by Shigeru Miyamoto and Katsuya Iguchi. Iguchi's first game that he ever worked on for Nintendo was Super Mario Bros. 3 as a level designer, and he's worked on many, many games since then. But Katsuya Iguchi is best known for being the creator of Animal Crossing. Character design was done by Takaya Imamura. He designed the characters for F-Zero as well as Star Fox, and he's been involved in basically every Star Fox and F-Zero game ever made. He was also the art director for Majora's Mask, where he created the character Tingle. What an incredible legacy to be known as the guy who created Tingle. Absolute legend. As far as the Argonaut side of the dev team, Dylan Cuthbert, Giles Goddard, and Christopher Wambell are credited as programmers on the game, as they were helping Nintendo with the implementation of the Super FX chip. And they actually worked in Japan in Nintendo's headquarters, although they were sequestered away in like a closed off room away from the rest of Nintendo while they did their work. And I believe Dylan Cuthbert tells a funny story about how Miyamoto would visit them quite often to give them feedback, or so that's what everybody thought. It's like, oh, Miyamoto's coming to give feedback on this game that we're working on. But coincidentally, the room that the Star Fox team was put in, or the programmers from Argonaut were put in, was the only room in Nintendo's offices where Miyamoto was allowed to smoke. And he was a notorious smoker at the time. He was smoking a lot. I just think that's really funny, to where just imagine you're a English-speaking team of programmers working at the Nintendo HQ in Japan, and the father of like modern video games, Shigeru Miyamoto, just keeps coming and visiting you, and you're like, oh, he's offering feedback, but every time he's coming to visit you, he's just like, oh yeah, that looks good, and he's just lighting up cigarettes the entire time. That whole scenario in my mind just makes me laugh. I think that's really, really funny. I don't think Miyamoto's smoking as much anymore, and I think he's prioritized his health, but I think that was pretty common back in the day, that those guys worked really long hours. They were smokers. When they had time off, they would go out and they would drink, and they would, let off steam, because they're just literally working all the time to make these games. For Star Fox, it was reported by Peter Main himself, who was the head of sales at Nintendo of America, that Star Fox had a $15 million marketing budget, which was a record for a Nintendo game at the time. And this is documented in a newspaper clipping from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch from 1993. R-Wings, the game's signature spaceships, were inspired by X-Wings from Star Wars, and they could have easily gone with just a traditional, humans flying spaceships in space, but Miyamoto wanted to go with anthropomorphic animal characters because he wanted it to be different from those traditional sci-fi settings, which is robots and humans and aliens. So, hey, what if we just put a fox in a space fighter jet and had him fly it around? You might know of the famous cover art for Star Fox on the box, the artwork on the box, right? This features puppets of the Star Fox team, which is a little kind of weird. It's almost like a uncanny valley situation when you're looking at them, that it just feels like you can tell what they are. It just feels a little bit strange in the way that they tried to make them look lifelike. Well, the reason for this was that Miyamoto was a fan of British puppet dramas at the time, which is apparently a thing. I didn't look up British puppet dramas on YouTube. Maybe I should have, just to kind of get an idea, but apparently British puppet dramas were a thing. I guess, am I imagining like a show like Downton Abbey, but it's done with puppets or something like that, or a show like The Crown, but it's just done with puppets? I don't know, but that was the whole reasoning, that he wanted to use puppets for the box art. There's a little bit of plot and lore that we can get from the first Star Fox game if you dig a little bit. I'm just going to stick to just the brief overview of what we learn in the Super Nintendo game and some of the expanded stuff that would be included in like Star Fox 64 and some expanded materials. I guess there was like a Star Fox like manga or comic that kind of expanded on some of the lore. So that's kind of cool. Andros was a scientist who was banished from Corneria to Venom, and he declares war on Corneria after this and the entire Lilat system, which is where the game takes place. General Pepper hires the Star Fox team to pilot the cutting-edge R-Wings and defeat Andros. And Star Fox team, of course, consists of Fox McCloud, Peppy Hare, Falco Lombardi, and Slippy Toad. To expand on this lore, Star Fox team, this kind of mercenary group, was founded by Fox's father, James McCloud, alongside Peppy Hare and Pigma Dengar. They were mercenaries that took freelance work in the Lilat system, and they made so much money. I guess mercenary work is good in the Lilat system. They made so much money that James, Fox's father, financed the construction of the Great Fox to be their base of operations by taking out an 80-year loan. And that'll be relevant in a second here. Andros had caused mass casualties with his experiments on Corneria, and that is when he was banished to Venom by General Pepper. But 5 years later, there was suspicious activity occurring on the planet. Pepper hires Star Fox to check it out, but Pigma betrays them, having been paid a lot of money by Andros to switch sides. And then it's kind of believed that Wolf of Team Starwolf had a hand in this betrayal as well, which led to the presumed death of James McCloud. Peppy barely escapes and promises to look after James' son Fox as Fox takes over the Star Fox team. I put that whole thing in there about James McCloud basically taking out an 80-year mortgage to build the Great Fox because there's an interesting tidbit on the Star Fox wiki in the lore that I found really funny. Apparently, it costs a lot of money to hire Star Fox, and this is voiced by General Pepper in later games. So you don't just throw Star Fox a couple of dollars and they just go and fight a war for you. It costs a lot of money to hire them, and this is because Fox had to take over the loan for the Great Fox from his father. So there is no debt forgiveness in the Star Fox universe. When you die, you still have to pay it back, and Fox had to take over the loan payments. So this is why it costs a lot of money to hire the Star Fox team. I thought this was kind of funny. It just seemed very comical to me in a world where we're fighting over student loan debt and this the debt of the country is just growing. And even in a fictional game about animals flying around in space, Fox still has to worry about debt and paying off the debt for his flying mobile fortress that they all fly around in, basically. That is their base of operations. I find that really, really funny. So let's talk about the gameplay a little bit, because that is the main thing that you're coming to Star Fox for is the gameplay. You're not coming for any kind of philosophical discussion on the horrors of war or anything like that. I don't think the lore, the plot, ever quite touch on themes that are deeper than surface level. Certainly not anything that I would be able to dive into in any kind of expanded fashion in the way that I do. But gameplay consists of flying around the R-Wings through different environments while stuff flies and shoots at you. It's a rail shooter. That is the literal definition of what that is. There are buttons for a thruster to increase your speed and retro rockets to decrease your speed. L and R on the controller tilt you left and right, and double presses do a barrel roll. Cue the meme. Taking damage from projectiles or collisions lowers your shields. One really cool touch is that your wings of the R-Wing can become damaged and break off, affecting maneuverability. And this is really funny when they do break off, because your ship goes from basically 3 triangles that, and 2 of them extend out off the body to represent wings, 3 elongated triangles to 1 main elongated triangle flying forward with a thruster, and then 2 little stub triangles on the left and right of the ship as you're flying around. It's a very funny visual. Obviously, you press a button to shoot laser blasts. There are weapon upgrades. You can upgrade your single shot to a double shot, and then to what's called a Type B twin blaster with another upgrade, which is just a more powerful type of double shot. If you die, though, you lose that upgrade. There are smart bombs, which are screen clearing bombs that are scarce but powerful. There are different types of rings that you can fly through. Checkpoint rings, energy rings to restore shields, power shield rings that make you invulnerable. Obviously, you're not alone. You play as Fox, but your teammates Peppy, Slippy, and Falco fly the missions with you. They often require saving, and you can save them throughout the course of the missions. I believe it's if they get hit 4 times, they are gone for the rest of the game. And I think the most interesting thing about Star Fox is the way in which you can progress through the game. There are 3 different paths. So all paths always start on the planet Corneria and end at Venom. And you can pick either the upper path, the middle path, and the lower path. And depending on which path you pick, the presentation of the Corneria level will be different depending on how you choose. So the middle path is considered the easy path. I believe the upper path is medium and the lower path is hard mode. I played through the game on all 3 paths, and I gotta say, after playing the upper and lower path portions, the middle path is incredibly, incredibly easy. So it was really nice of them to have a difficulty selector in that way to where you could play the game at 3 different difficulties. Although if you're only able to beat the game on normal difficulty and take the middle path straight through, you don't really get to see the rest of the content of the game, which some of it is different, but ultimately the entire game consists of you're flying through different environments and shooting stuff to get to the end of the game. That's what it boils down to. As far as presentation and the way the game looks, I want to talk about audio presentation first. The composer for this game was Hajime Hirasawa. Did an awesome job with the soundtrack. The soundtrack is incredible. When I think of the Super Nintendo and the amazing soundtracks on the Super Nintendo, this is definitely one of the games that I think about. All the songs here are iconic to the series and to Nintendo as a whole. I still hear them in their Super Nintendo iterations. I still hear them in their Super Smash Bros. Iterations. Absolutely incredible. Especially that intro level, Corneria level theme. It bumps so hard and really like sets the stage and gets you into the mood for the rest of the game. And all the sound effects are very good too. Nothing crazy out of the ordinary that I would say. A ship boosting, a bomb exploding, blasters going off, a very crunchy kind of sounding damage noise when you get hit. So yeah, the sound effects, good for what they need to do in this game, right? I would say that where this game struggles with today, if you're going back to play Star Fox on the Super Nintendo today, it is probably one of the more difficult games to go back to on the Super Nintendo. It looks like very, very simple, rudimentary 3D shapes flying around on the screen, and it tends to chug sometimes. I mean, we're dropping into like maybe like the mid to low teens for frame rate when a bunch of stuff starts to show up on the screen. And this is especially noticeable in some of the asteroid field stages where there are portions where asteroids would like just start flying at you and you're trying to like fly around and shoot all the asteroids and there's stuff flying at you. And the game just tends to kind of slow down in a way that is definitely more noticeable than other titles on the Super Nintendo. I don't think it makes the game unplayable, but I think it's very, very noticeable, especially today if you're playing it under a modern lens and you have kind of that focus on resolution and frame rate and refresh rate and all that stuff. You want your game to look as silky, buttery smooth as possible, play silky, buttery smooth as possible. If you're one of those people that values those things in your video games, that yeah, you're going to have a really hard time if you go back and check this out, because Star Fox, with the help of the Super Effects chip, feels like it is bumping up against the absolute ceiling of what the Super Nintendo is actually capable of. And probably with the Super FX chip, it's probably pushing it a little bit beyond what the Super Nintendo is capable of at full capacity, right? That's why they had to have the Super FX chip in the cartridge so that the Super Nintendo would be able to do things with the 3D shapes and the 3D graphics that they were going for. That was the whole point of having the Super FX chip. It would be just a short year later that the PlayStation 1 would come out and we would start to have rudimentary 3D graphics like this on a disc-based system that wouldn't need a dedicated chip on a cartridge to be able to do things like that. It's a very, very rudimentary example of early 3D gaming on a system that was not necessarily designed for 3D gaming. And I find that very, very interesting because it had things built in, the Super Nintendo did, like Mode 7, to simulate the look of 3D, but it wasn't quite 3D because it was just like kind of like rotating and presenting the screen in a way that made it feel 3D, but it wasn't actually. So yeah, I think it's very difficult to go back and play this game today because it looks pretty rough, it plays pretty rough, it tends to chug along, and you have to play it for a little bit before you can kind of distinguish between all the things on screen and figure out what they do and figure out what things you should be flying towards and what things you should be avoiding, and to be able to like pick out things that are flying at you on a screen full of things that are flying at you and shooting at you while the game chugs to like a mid-teens FPS rate. One thing I do really love about the visual presentation, though, is I love the character portraits of Fox, Falco, Peppy, and Slippy. They are this iconic like 2D Super Nintendo sprite artwork, and the way that they kind of talk to each other at the end of the mission each time, and you finish the mission and they're flying away to the next one, and while it tallies up your score, Fox is like, check in, and all the different characters, Falco, Peppy, and Slippy, have their different ways of talking, and it's basically just like this Charlie Brown teacher type of babble. It's just noises made in that character's voice. Very, very funny, but that kind of presentation of those characters, classic Super Nintendo 2D sprite artwork, looks incredible. The R-Wing would go on to be one of the most recognizable spaceships in video game history, maybe in pop culture history. So despite the fact that the game looks rough and doesn't play the best, I think that the art direction that was established here would go on to inform the future of the franchise. I think the direction is very good. They're limited by what they're trying to do with the technology, and making a game this advanced for a system that couldn't do this advance of a game without help from a chip put into the cartridge that the game was on. I think seeing what's coming down the pipeline with Star Fox 64, I think that's when they would be able to fully realize the vision, the art direction of the game that they were going for. And I think despite the fact that a lot of stuff just looks like rudimentary shapes flying around, the art direction here would go on to inform and build a foundation for what would come in the rest of the series. So like I said, this is definitely going to be a shorter episode because I'm at the legacy and final thoughts portion of my notes. And I think that the legacy of Star Fox, the game for the Super Nintendo, and the series as a whole, because this is the game that establishes the Star Fox franchise. Without Star Fox and the Super Nintendo, you don't have Star Fox 64, you don't have Fox and Falco in Smash, you don't have Do a Barrel Roll meme. So, Star Fox has that legacy component of being the game to establish the franchise. And it was born out of Nintendo's desire to show the superiority of their hardware over the Sega Genesis. Having been around for the conversations I've seen online, and again, this is just what I've heard discussed in the community, I can't really comment beyond Star Fox for the Super Nintendo because I haven't played any of the other Star Fox games. But it seems to me that this early era of Star Fox is pretty highly regarded compared to where the series would go in the future. While I don't think the Super Nintendo version has aged particularly well, I don't think it is unplayable. I think it is probably something you should check out if you're checking out like a list, if you're running through a list of games that you should play on the Super Nintendo. I think Star Fox plays an important role in the history of that console and what Nintendo is trying to do to fight back against the threat of Sega. The conversations around Star Fox in the 90s leads me to believe that Star Fox 64 just seems to be considered by many the pinnacle of what these games could be. I just don't hear the same level of reverence used when discussing the titles that come after this. And I don't have the experience to confidently comment on the discourse around that. But like I said, it seems to me that the later titles like Star Fox Adventures, Assault, Command, and Zero are, I guess the best word I could use is more divisive because I'm not going to sit here and say that those games are bad, having never experienced them myself. I don't feel that I have the ability to comment on something that I just don't have a lot of time invested in, and I can't form an opinion on it if I haven't experienced. I know, what a shocking idea, right? I should be able to just fire off tweets in my opinion about whatever I feel like, but I'm not going to throw my opinion out there in a discourse that's not informed. That's just not who I am. I'm not going to do it. I would argue that just based on what I know, that the legacy of Star Fox has been more rooted in Smash Brothers lately than in the actual Star Fox games. And this comes with Fox being one of the most iconic characters, especially from Smash Melee, known for his fast gameplay, and that kind of style of gameplay would go on, that would extend throughout the entire Smash Bros. Series. Same thing with Falco. Wolf plays a little bit slower, but obviously they would add Wolf into Smash Brothers Brawl, I believe it was. So Star Fox as a franchise is in Smash, one of the biggest gaming franchises of the last 20 years. But I would say that the discussion around what Fox is as a character and what he does is more rooted in his playstyle in the Smash Brothers games rather than what he's doing in the actual Star Fox games. We haven't had a Star Fox product released since 2016, and just looking at the reviews for Star Fox Zero, it seems like it had a pretty lukewarm reception. I seem to remember at the time when it came out that it was not received very well. It wasn't what people were expecting. There was palpable excitement around a new Star Fox game, but when it came out, it just felt like people were disappointed in what Star Fox Zero was. I don't really know what the future of the series is. Like I said, it's been since 2016 that we've gotten anything Star Fox. Maybe there's an opportunity on the Switch 2 to bring Star Fox back on a new, more powerful console. But I would have to reference something that Shigeru Miyamoto said about making another F-Zero game. And I believe it was him who famously said that he wouldn't do another F-Zero unless he had a way to iterate on the gameplay in a fun and exciting way. He didn't want to just push out another F-Zero game into the wild that was the exact same thing that he had done, which is weird because Nintendo's put out stuff that's just basically been like the same game. Like, look at all the new Super Mario Brothers games are basically the same game, and they just put that game out like 4 or 5 different times with slightly different coats of paint and slightly different power-ups. So for him to say that he wouldn't put out F-Zero, he wouldn't put F-Zero out unless he had a way to like iterate on it is kind of baffling. It might be related to that just F-Zero isn't one of Nintendo's more popular franchises, so why would they put effort towards making an F-Zero game? I don't know why I thought of that when I was thinking of Star Fox, but I just have to imagine that given the reception of Star Fox Zero, that maybe he would hold a similar stance. Nintendo's most well-known IPs have kind of undergone transformations during the Switch's life cycle, now the Switch 2 life cycle. Obviously with Zelda, Breath of the Wild, and Tears of the Kingdom shaking up that formula. Mario with Odyssey doing its iteration on the 3D Mario formula, and then we had Super Mario Brothers Wonder come out and kind of do its iteration on the new Super Mario Brothers series. Metroid came out, and Metroid kind of tweaked the formula that it had found in Metroid Fusion and did this thing with like the Emmys to create like this fear and dread, no joke there, to kind of create a modern rendition of a Metroid game. All these games have kind of tweaked their core gameplay a little bit during the Switch's life cycle. And even the upcoming Donkey Kong game, Donkey Kong Bonanza, looks set to do the same on the Switch 2. It looks like a complete reinvention of what we know and expect Donkey Kong to be. Donkey Kong as a series has been very heavily, mostly defined by Donkey Kong Country. That's how all the Donkey Kong games have been, right? There hasn't really been anything that has strayed away too drastically from Donkey Kong Country's formula and been like a smash success. And then Donkey Kong has just basically showed up in every side Mario game, like Mario Party, Mario Kart, and all these other ones. But this seems to be the first big iteration on a Donkey Kong game in a long time. So Nintendo has been going through their IPs and making modern iterations to formulas that have been established over the course of their life cycles. So the question would be, is it worth it for Nintendo to try and figure out how to do that with Star Fox, to offer a new modern Star Fox game, but still retain the core of what makes a Star Fox game a Star Fox game? And I guess that would be the challenge. I guess to close it out here, as far as Star Fox on the Super Nintendo goes, it established a new franchise for Nintendo. It was commercially successful, and it appears to have done what Nintendo needed it to do during that time period. It helped it fight back against Sega. You know, we had the string of games like Star Fox and Donkey Kong Country that came out and were really, really successful. And I think probably helped move the needle and respond to all the stuff that Sega was doing. I would argue that Star Fox on SNES has not aged particularly well. It was difficult at times to figure out what was going on the screen. The frame rate was all over the place, and it's, again, very rudimentary, as you'd expect from a 3D game on the Super Nintendo that needed a dedicated chip in the cartridge to help it run. I can't emphasize that enough. Like, this game would not have been possible if they didn't put the Super FX chip in it. But I think it represents something. I think it's kind of a promise of the future, of the way that games were evolving. Like I said, we were starting to get early examples of 3D video games. Star Fox, the PlayStation, would come out a year later and start doing things in 3D. And while a lot of PlayStation games have not aged particularly well, they were on the forefront, the cutting edge of what 3D gameplay was going to be. While I ultimately think that games that were around the same time, like Donkey Kong Country, looked better, I think Star Fox made a promise of 3D on Nintendo 3 years before the Nintendo 64 would release, and I feel like that promise would ultimately be fulfilled in Super Mario 64. And if you just kind of line up what Star Fox looked like in its presentation versus what would ultimately be put out in Super Mario 64, that advancement in technology and game development across 3 years is unbelievable. And it's difficult to describe that now because the last couple generations, we just haven't seen jumps that drastic from generation to generation. It's been less and less each successive console generation that's come out. But for Nintendo to go from Star Fox, which is basically just shapes flying around on a screen, shooting other shapes, and the incredible expansive world and gameplay of Super Mario 64 in 3 years' time is mind-blowing. And I think putting it in that context kind of allows Star Fox to occupy this space of, it is an important game in Nintendo's history, and it was one that they used to fight back against their competitors, and a game that they used to begin that transition to the era of 3D that was coming. And that's just my thoughts on it. I could be completely off the rails on that one, but that's when I look at everything that was going on at that time period and my understanding of the console war between Sega and Nintendo, that's what I feel like was happening at this time. And I think Star Fox is an incredible relic of its time period. Difficult to go back and play, but I still really enjoyed my time with it. As always, thank you guys so much for tuning in. It always, always means the world to me that you're willing to give me an hour of your time and just listen to me ramble. Thank you to the members of our Discord, of our community, who submitted their brief reviews of Star Fox to be featured in this episode. Their own projects, if they have them, will be featured in the show notes, so make sure you go and check that out. I am, of course, recording this before I know who all submitted reviews to be featured in the episode, but please go and check out all the content creators in the show notes who submitted their reviews to be featured in the episodes. I'm going to do that more often because I'm unable to do guest episodes in the way that I want to and devote the time to have people come on my show. But in this way, if people want to have their voices heard on my show and be able to shout out what they're working on the Unlockables, this is the way to do it. So please go and support them and give them a listen. They're all incredible people. Everybody in the Unlockables Discord makes stuff that is absolutely incredible. If you're interested in getting away from just the standard, summary video essay or just, listing off summary points generated by ChatGPT and recorded and put out on the internet, go and join the Unlockables Discord, get to know the creators in there, and go check out their shows because everybody does really great and unique analysis. As far as this show, as I mentioned at the top, if you want to catch up with everything that is going on in the world of the Unlockables, you can head over to linktr.ee/Unlockables podcast. All of the social links for the show are there. My Blue Sky, Instagram, the link to the Discord are there as well. And two, I just want to shout out specifically and highlight, if you could go on over to the Unlockables YouTube page and subscribe. I'm going to be putting out more content there. The most recent thing I released on the YouTube page is a essay on the most recent Zelda game, Echoes of Wisdom, and I kind of build my thoughts into what Nintendo releasing this specific Zelda game at the end of the Switch's life cycle tells us about the future of Zelda, considering they put out 2 landmark games in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. I'm really proud of that episode. It's done surprisingly well for me, which I did not expect it to do. So go and check that out. Subscribe to the Unlockables YouTube. I have some other great essays coming later this year. We will have one in a month or two on my first playthrough of Chrono Trigger and what it means to celebrate the 30th anniversary of that game. And I'll also have one on some of the themes that I found captivating in the latest hit game, Clair Obscur Expedition 33. So go and subscribe. And also, if you want to support the show, you can go on over to the Unlockables Patreon. I have a $1 tier and a $3 tier for support. I'm going to start putting more things up on the Patreon as incentives for people to join. Just some stuff I wouldn't normally put on the main feed, maybe some stream of conscious things, some video game industry things, just to give you a little bit of incentive. But if you want to support the show, you can do that as little as $1. And support the show in more ways than like just listening to it. And of course, you don't have to. All of my usual stuff will be kept on the Unlockables main feed for free. I won't lock anything behind paywalls, but just some of the other random stuff I do, I might throw up on the Patreon. So yeah, that's going to do it for Star Fox. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. And always remember, it's not just the story of video games, it is the story of you.
Yeah, Steve Stay Cool here. Back in the saddle, whatever the saddle is. Some Star Fox. I'm gonna tell you about the time I did let's just say there's some tea I had down in Mexico. Not like that Lipton tea. This was like some spiritual guidance tea. I wasn't alone. There was this guy named Radar. Don't ask me why. And he said, we're heading down to the gathering. I'm like, juggalos. But he called it the celebration of the inner animal. I thought, spiritual stuff. Like satanic soul work. And then suddenly I came to freezing just in the middle of the woods somewhere near abandoned Bass Pro Shop in Western Ohio, I think. Not even a convention center. Surrounded by foxes, glowing, moving in perfect formation through the trees like some military precision. So I'm standing there, right, pants half off, hearing whispers of doing a barrel roll over and over in my head like a prayer, and I start sobbing uncontrollably. Some real open heart energy shit. And next day I wake up and there's beef jerky in my sock and my wallet's missing. And I think that's how I met my first wife, Peppy. But anyway, I hope you're doing well. Hope your little podcast gets what it needs to get done. And stay cool out.